Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at the subject of slice editing. This is a subset of the functionality in Halion, and it allows us to identify individual sections of sound inside something like a rhythmic beat or an arpeggio, and be able to treat each one of those audio samples individually rather than dealing with the entire thing. If you're enjoying this series so far, please check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's a really awesome way to help support my channel. Okay, let's make a start. I'm going to use this Compton House Drums sample. I'm going to drag that into the sample player, throw the media bay away, and this is what we have. Pretty straightforward rhythm. Jump over to the sample page and then over to the slice tab. Let's zoom out fully so that we can see the entire thing. Now, all of these white markers that you can see in the window, they're what Halion currently interprets as the various slices that it's going to make of this sample. You can see there are a lot of them. Each one of these individual sections in between each of these markers is going to be turned into its very own sample zone. Now, part of the art of using the slice editor is figuring out how many of these markers to have, and it's obviously going to be an entirely subjective decision. We've got some controls at the bottom of the window to enable us to control these markers, so let's have a bit of a play with them. First thing to mention is that at the moment we're in transient mode, which means that Halion is identifying transients, in other words peaks, individual momentary peaks in the sample. That's what it's using to generate these markers. This threshold control draws these red parallel lines in the sample, and as you see me increase and decrease the threshold, it's basically saying wherever these red lines currently are, the transients, these peaks in audio, must intersect that line in order for Halion to identify that this is where the markers need to be created. This is probably the most important, the most useful method of generating individual markers, particularly when we're in transient mode, because it's all about identifying these peaks in the audio. The sensitivity control to the right of threshold determines the quality that these transients must meet. So at 0, Halion will basically interpret almost anything at the right volume as a transient. As we turn sensitivity up, you can see it's starting to throw some of those markers away. It's basically becoming more and more picky about how it identifies the sharpness of a transient. Transients are all about instantaneous noise lasting for a very small period of time and then disappearing. That's basically what a transient is, as opposed to like white noise, which is a constant, flat level, very loud noise. You don't have transients in white noise. I'm conscious that I want to get to the stage where we've generated some slices so that I can demonstrate this as quickly as possible, but we'll very quickly have a look at the third control, min length, and then we'll come back and look at this stuff in a little bit more detail. So min length literally specifies how short each one of these zones is allowed to be. As we increase the minimum length, it's pretty obvious what it's doing. It's throwing away markers because the individual zones are no longer long enough. Once we've got something reasonably sensible as far as the marker positions are concerned, we're going to click this apply button. And Halion's now sliced that sample up into all these individual zones. If you look over on the right hand side in the program tree, you can also see we've got new stuff here. I'm just going to throw that away, revert, basically undoes that operation. Here's our single zone, click apply again, and now the zone turns into a layer. Inside that layer, we've got a ton of brand new stuff. Right at the very top, we have this MIDI module called a slice player. Very quick look at it. Here it is. We'll come back and study it in greater detail shortly. Underneath, we've got all of the individual zones. Each one of these 18 different zones corresponds to a part of that overall sample. If I select zone number 4, you can see that zone number 4 has been highlighted in the editor. Here's zone number 5, and there it is. If I have the play slice tool activated and I click inside that zone, you'll hear just that zone. The master sample underneath, by the way, is still absolutely intact. This is all non-destructive. That's why we can press this revert button so easily and throw all of this stuff away. Have a look at the virtual keyboard below. These white keys correspond to the 18 individual zones. So C3 has been mapped to zone number 1. If I click C3, you hear this first zone. It's the same thing. Here's C#3. Now, it isn't just each one of those pitched MIDI notes I need to play in order to replicate this sample. I need to replicate each of the lengths as well, because as you can see, each of the zones is of a different length. Let's represent that a little bit more clearly by throwing it into Cubase. I'm going to pick up this drag MIDI phrase icon and drop the phrase into Cubase. Now let's have a look at how Cubase interprets that information. Here are all of the MIDI notes. Here are all of their various different lengths as well. If I play that phrase from the beginning, and you can see that my tempo is currently set to the tempo of the sample that we've imported, this is going to play back perfectly. So all we've done is split that sample up into 18 chunks, assigned each one of those chunks to a different MIDI key, and when we drag that phrase out of the slice editor, it plays back perfectly. That's stage one. This is where you want to get to as quickly as possible when you're doing slice editing. Now you can be creative with it, because of course I'm free to play those keys in any configuration I want. Here's my C, there's a G. Just by toggling between C and G, I'm now playing a brand new rhythm. So let's mess with this rhythm a little bit. One of the things that we can do is to rearrange the notes. Now you need to be careful because some of these notes are shorter than others. This very short D3 phrase is just that. Every time I'm pressing D3 on the keyboard here. It's just that. If I move a much longer phrase down onto D3 and play this phrase again, you're obviously going to get a big silence because this entire space over here, there's no sample to play back, the sample's been done. So if you want to rearrange these MIDI notes, it's quite a nice rule of thumb to just play with families of notes of the same length. So all of these notes that are 1/8 long can basically be moved freely within the constraints of their family group, and you're going to build a different rhythm that's going to maintain some sort of consistency because all of the notes are still of the right length. So now we've got a new rhythm. Okay, so that's a decent enough basic introduction to the concept of slicing. Let's throw all of that away. Let's revert that process to get back to our editor mode. Can you see every time I press apply or revert, the controls in the slice editor change? So these are the controls where you set up your markers and the mechanism that Halion's going to use to identify the various marker positions. Once we've clicked apply, the controls down below operate on a zone by zone basis, and they're going to allow us to do some editing, for instance, to change the playback mode of each individual zone inside the sample collection. Let's switch modes, come out of transient mode, and we'll try grid mode instead. So now Halion isn't doing any analysis of transients. We don't have those threshold controls anymore. Now at the moment, these markers up at the top are in terms of seconds, but if we switch to bars and beats, it'll make a little bit more sense, and you can see that it's breaking it up into 4 bars. This is a 4-bar section. We have a grid control up at the top. If we set that to quarter instead, now it's going to set markers at every quarter note. That's okay, and it'll work. Let's do a very quick demonstration of that. Click apply, drag the phrase up into Cubase, and sure enough, here are all of those quarter notes, and it will still play back absolutely fine. Of course it is, because we've still got one continuous set of data, but we want to do some editing on it, and grid mode on its own quite often falls short, because when we have a look at the analysis behind the scenes, we can see that some of these grid markers are hopelessly wrong. This one, for instance, where I'm hovering over with my mouse, there's no beat there. So grid is completely arbitrary and a little bit dumb. So you want Halion to be a bit more intelligent than that. Happily, we have a hybrid mode called Transient plus Grid. And this is really the sweet spot of the slice editor, I think, because Halion's now applying both of those concepts. It's looking for transients, but it's also doing it in the context of grid patterns. And now, in addition to the controls we've already seen, we have grid catch. This is how close to the grid we have to be in order for these markers to be assigned. So as I start increasing grid catch, it's basically widening the zone of acceptability, the further distance away. See this marker here? It's quite a significant way from where we really want it to be. So to be absolutely honest, there's not a lot of point engaging grid and setting this catch too high, because the whole point is that you want it to be reasonably accurate. So let's reset these controls and see if we can get something a little bit more useful. The value of sensitivity drops quite a lot when you're in Transient plus Grid because basically other factors are more important than the quality of the transients. It helps, but it's less important. Similarly with minimum length, if I've specified a grid resolution, that's my main determinant of how long I want these grids to be, but nevertheless, there's no harm in having it basically just filter out any rubbish that might possibly pop through. And then we've already seen grid catch is how accurate, how close to the grid markers we want to be. And that looks fine. Let's give this a go and drag that into Cubase. So now we've got much greater consistency. Most of these beats are operating on a quarter note, and there's only a couple really where Halion said quarter notes don't work here. You need to have a longer period of time in order for this to make any kind of musical sense. And now it's much easier for us to start generating brand new rhythms out of this because so many more of the beats are the same length. Quite a nice thing to do if you're just kind of playing around with different rhythms is to select all of the notes that are a quarter note long. And if you open your logical editor, there's a function in factory presets called Randomise Notes. And these numbers here, 60 represents C3, which is basically the bottom of the range. And C4 is going to be at 72. So if I randomize all of the notes within that zone, I know that I'm going to need to manually correct F-sharp 3s and G-sharp 3s. I don't really want to be playing in those spaces. Let's just have the logical editor create brand new rhythms for us and see what we get. Any F-sharp 3s and G-sharp 3s are potentially problematic because we're only dealing with half of the rhythm, but it's actually working pretty well. That's quite good. I quite like that bit at the end. Let's throw those changes away, get back to our standard pattern. This time I'm going to edit some of the individual zones themselves. Again, we've got all of the different numbered zones. This time we're playing with 13 different zones because these basically subsamples, these sections of sample, they're now different lengths. We just randomly happen to have 13 in this configuration. If I select zone number 1, let's play that one backwards. So now every time I press C3 on the keyboard, or C3 gets played by Cubase, that individual zone, that single zone, is going to play backwards. Let's do this zone at the beginning of bar 3 as well. All I had to do was click in it with the play slice tool and it's auto-selected it for me. And now I can reverse that one too. So now this note and this note are going to play backwards. That one's not so good. First one's pretty good though. Before I abandon that second reverse completely, let's just try playing a little bit more with it. I'm going to put a filter on it. So this single zone now is going to be filtered so that it's much duller. I don't need to drag it back out into Cubase. All of this stuff is being played dynamically from very simple MIDI information. It's actually the beginning of the rhythm that's just causing me a bit of trouble. It's alright, I suppose, not rocking my world. Let's try one last thing, reversing the sample after it as well. It's basically the transition between G3 and G-sharp 3 that's causing me the trouble. Let's give this a go. Oh, that's not bad. Yeah, that's not bad. Got there eventually. So as you can see, many of the editing features that we've got for the entire sample, we've got for every one of these zones inside the slice player, inside its own dedicated editor. I'm going to throw all of those changes away, initialize my sample instrument back to its default state, and go back into the media bay. This time, I'm going to search for synth chords E. and it's an arpeggio I'm looking for. That's the fella. Electronica synth chords E. Drag that into our zone. Before we start slicing it up, let's have a listen to it. This time I'm going to rely on transient mode to generate my markers. And again, I'm trying to dial in a set of parameters that just give me like a fairly reasonable looking set of markers. That looks decent. Oh, that last one just popped in. Don't want that one right at the beginning. So if you're following along with this, let's just have a quick review. Threshold at -11.5, sensitivity 4, min length 155. Now this sample that we imported was at a different BPM. Can you see the editor's still at 106.99, which is the previous sample. It's going to override that and set it to 120. And having done so, you can see that now the length of the entire groove is 4 bars, which it should be. Let's click apply and then drag that out so that we can have a look at it in Cubase. Here are all of the notes, and obviously Cubase needs to be told that this is 120 BPM groove as well. Great stuff. Throw away that MIDI pattern again, back into Halion. Let's use this sliced sample to have a look at the slice player. What have we got in here? This is a MIDI module indicated by the icon. 2 different ways that you can look at MIDI modules. The sound tab almost always works because it's context sensitive to whatever's selected in the program tree, but the dedicated control is MIDI module, that basically showing you the same information. And this is where we control the playback of these, what are now 22 different zones. So the slice player is the thing that's in charge of basically kind of running through all of these zones, playing them in sequence. Behind the scenes, something that's been done that we don't particularly want to worry about today because we haven't had a look at the mapping editor yet, but it's inside the mapping editor where you can see all of the individual assignments. Any one of these zones that I select will be highlighted in the mapping editor, and this is basically what's mapping all of those zones to all of those different keys starting at C3. But for today, I just want to concern myself with the slice player, which is the thing that's in charge of playing them all as a holistic entity, all 22 zones being lumped together. Gate scale is quite a nice control. This determines how long each of the samples will be in the context of the played piece. So if I set the gate scale to 50, now each of the zones will play back for half of its total length, however long that happens to be. Don't forget, different zones are of different lengths. The slice player has its own drag MIDI phrase icon. It's exactly the same functionality, just accessed from a different place. And now you can immediately see what's happened. Each of the zones is being played for half of its total time, so you're going to get a staccato feel. Now towards the end of the phrase, these bigger gaps, because the zones are longer, the gaps that are being left when they're being truncated to 50%, just a little bit long for my liking. There is nothing stopping you manually editing all of these MIDI notes. They're just MIDI notes. They're just instructions to Halion to play this sample for this long. There's nothing magic going on here. Maybe I want that one as well. Now I've got a completely different feel to the groove. So the slice player is simply acting as a starting point. It's basically got this internal view of all of these zones and what it will do if it's asked to play back the information. When you drag those MIDI notes into Cubase, it's Cubase that takes over control of the playback of the zones. The sample player no longer has anything to do. Having said that, let's just delete that MIDI phrase. So this is the mode where we've got our gate scale set to 50, and that's been implicitly stored in variation 1. If I jump over to variation 2, you'll see gate scale set back to 100, so this is the default behavior. So now I can toggle very easily between those two states. If I select variation 1, drag that pattern into Cubase, there's the MIDI notes with the truncated lengths. In variation 2, drag that phrase into Cubase. Here, each of those zones are played back for their full length. Let's throw those MIDI parts away and engage random mode. Now it will literally play back all of those zones in a random order. So this is variation 2 with full gate scale, randomized notes. Drag that into Cubase, and now random is as random does. So all of the features in this player, I don't propose to talk about every one of them today because it's simply a MIDI playback editor. Everything that we adjust in this editor is for that moment in time. This individual variations, we've got 8 different banks of like recorded stuff to store. But all you're doing is managing the playback of these zones. You're not doing anything destructive to either the original sample or the 22 zones as edited. Now there's a second kind of analysis that we can perform on the audio as well. It's called decompose. I've done a separate dedicated video for decompose, so I'm not going to cover it in detail. I'll put a link above to the video I made about that subject. Decompose is all about analysing the tonal quality of a sample. So it will basically split a sample up into its tonal component and its noise component. And you can do some really cool stuff with each of those features. Like I say, check out the video above for examples of that functionality in use. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.